This lecture will be about Hesiod's works and days and his Theogony. And I'm going to take a slightly different approach. I'm going to start with the works and days and take out what I think are the main points, and then read the Theogony in light of the works and days. I'm doing that because Hesiod started out life just having experiences, sensation, perception, imagination, memory, experience. So he started out with observations, just like every other human being, and he started to see patterns, and then he gained wisdom from his life, and then he decided to write a creation story, a story about the origins of the world based on his own understanding of life, both the good life and also the obstacles that get in the way. So I'm going to talk about uh, his works and days are about daily life and what he's learned or what he's learning. The first thing he starts out with is two kinds of strife. And one kind is Eris, and this is the worst kind. This is just aggression for the sake of aggression. And so this turns out to be Tartarus. There's a violent principle as one of the four principles in the creation story, but there's a level of competition and aggression that's destructive, not creative. That's one kind of strife. She's a mean cuss, and nobody likes her. This ornery Eris. She's the one that kind of started the whole domino effect that ended up with the Trojan War too. So that's important to remember. And probably the story of the Trojan War was around in Hesiod's time. So he's going to start out saying, yeah, I know about that. And then the other kind of strife is more like a healthy competition, and it motivates people to get up and work. Their desire to do better than the next guy, their desire to evolve themselves and also their society by one upping somebody. Now, that's going to come up in the creation story. So I want you to remember that. Two kinds of strife. One is destructive and one is creative. It leads to a higher level of evolution. The next point he makes is why life is hard. Why do we suffer? And his story is it's because Prometheus tried to trick God. Um, Zeus made life hard for people and he hid fire, but Prometheus stole the fire. And the fire, of course, made it easier for people to live. That's why he stole it. So Zeus got revenge and sent down Pandora and gave Pandora as a gift to um, Hesiod's to Epimetheus, and Epimetheus took it. And then the woman, I assume was Epimetheus' wife, is the one that opened the jar and let out all the evils, such as disease and all the other obstacles we have. But these are physical obstacles, so I think this is important. The evils are disease, um, they're physical, they're not psychological. So that's one thing. So the thing that's interesting here is that Prometheus has foresight. That's what his name means, foresight. Epimetheus is hindsight, and he's passive, and he gives in to the beauty of Pandora, right? He lets her beguile him. Okay, so the rest of the story, most of the rest of Works and Days, Hesiod is playing the role of Prometheus. He's the older brother, and he has a younger brother who's a lazy good for nothing, and he's giving his younger brother advice. And he's telling his younger brother, the cause of evils in the world is when people don't live well. They're not virtuous. They're lazy good for nothings, like his brother. So his final word, Hesiod really emphasizes this section on justice. So I'm going to read it to you, quite a bit of it, because this is the key. I think this is what's driving Hesiod, is what he learned from life is that the ultimate value is justice. And then after that, he also spends the rest of it talking about how to use your mind and calculate how to be a good farmer and how to be good at trade, dealing with shipbuilding and the oceans and knowing about the tides and the winds and all the natural forces so that you can calculate the best means to your well-being. So he's just like Prometheus. He's using foresight and he's using his mind to promote his own flourishing. So, it's there's an interesting kind of interpretation to that. In the myth, Prometheus has supposedly made a mistake. He stole fire from the gods. But ever since then, we're supposed to use our foresight, and God wants us to use our foresight to get along, to survive. But the ultimate value is justice. And his brother, again, this isn't necessarily historically accurate, but it could be historically accurate, which goes back to Aristotle, is that the poet tells stories that are universals, not particulars, but they're things that are possible or probable. And that's why the tragedians use historical characters that actually lived, but they weave these myths about them that might not be one bit factually accurate. But you, Perseus, you listen to justice and don't cultivate violence. Now, I'm going to use the word hubris because that's the word in Hesiod. Hubris is the bad, the evil, the thing not to do. And hubris means a lot of things, but overstepping the bounds means going to an extreme. And this again fits totally with Aristotle. Usually it's the extreme of excess and violence and aggression. So this is what he says. Violent, hubric behavior is bad for a poor man. Even a rich man can't afford it, but it's going to bog him down in ruin someday. Okay, so even a rich person is going to be ruined by hubris, which is, there are a lot of indirect referring to the Trojan War. And so either the story of the Trojan War was already around, or else Homer, and Homer represents the poetic tradition, the bards picked up on what Hesiod said and start to weave their story of the Trojan War. So there's definitely an interweaving going on. Which came first is who cares? And they might have played off on each other also. So justice beats out hubris. A fool learns this the hard way. Also, Oath, who's a god, keeps up with crooked verdicts, and there's a ruckus when the Lady Justice gets dragged through the streets by corrupt judges who swallow bribes and pervert their verdicts. Later she finds her way back into town, weeping, wrapped in mist, and she gives grief to the men who drove her out and didn't do right by her. But when the judges judge straight, for neighbor as well as for strangers, and never turn their backs on justice, their city blossoms, their people bloom. You'll find peace all up and down the land. Okay, This is important because Hesiod, as Aristotle says, originally people lived in family groups, tribes, and then they started to expand their association to be able to live more efficiently to meet their basic physical needs. But then Aristotle says there was this fundamental shift to political association, to living together under the rule of law, to thinking of yourself as living in a community with people you don't know under the rule of law. And that was a higher level of association. That kind of association is for the good life, not the mere life. And my thesis, or what I think here, is Hesiod realizes this. This is one of his switches from experience to art or to politics, and it's based on that ability to understand the underlying principles and causes of the universe, of human nature, and of the place of culture in nature, and to realize that we're capable with our minds of understanding, relating to other people we don't know personally. That takes that takes thought, and then creating these set of rules, boundaries, that we all agree on. This is takes a lot of intellectual development, and it's a higher level of social evolution. And we shouldn't take it lightly when we read it. I mean, because we're reading it way later. At the time, I think Hesiod just kept wanting to keep emphasizing this, because this is going to create a culture. There's going to be leisure. People aren't going to be desperately looking just to survive all the time. And they aren't going to be being afraid of getting attacked all the time. So the love of justice is going to create the conditions for things like poetry and all the other learning related to the poet. So the poets, remember, the muse of astronomy and astrology, creating a stable community based on justice opens the door for people to activate their muses, all 9 of the muses. Okay. But for those who live for hubris and vice, Zeus, son of Cronus, broad-browed god, decrees a just penalty, and often a whole city suffers for one bad man and his damn fool schemes. That's Troy, right? He might lay low their army, or tumble down their city walls, or sink all their ships at sea. Okay, that sounds familiar. Troy. And also, on the way back, so many ships got sunk at sea because the Achaeans weren't any more unjust than the Trojans. They were both unjust. And there's the virgin Justice, Zeus's own daughter, honored and revered among the Olympian gods. Whenever anyone hurts her by besmirching her name, she sits down by the son of Cronus, her father, and speaks to him about men's unjust hearts, until the people pay for their foolhardy rulers' unjust verdicts and biased decisions. And this is where Odysseus is the one who listens to Athena. Okay. Plan harm. Okay. Then he says, plan harm for another and harm yourself most. The evil we hatch always comes home to roost. And this is, I've already said in Hesiod's story, there's the Zeus on Mount Olympus and the principles of equilibrium and evolution. And the Zeus on Olympus is watching all of this. And if human beings overstep the bounds, they will pay the price, because the universe will find its way back to equilibrium and back to its own kind of evolution. And if somebody steps out of that, they're going to pay the price. But to men he gave justice, and that works out all to the good. If you know in your heart what's right and come out and say so, broad-browed Zeus will give you prosperity. But if you bear false witness or lie under oath, and by damaging justice ruin yourself beyond hope or cure, your bloodline will weaken and your descendants fade out. But a man who stands by his word leaves a strong line of kinfolk. Okay, this is another big theme in Greek paideia texts, is that you should think about the legacy that you leave behind, and the mistakes that you make have an effect many generations after you. And this is clear in all the stories, especially since you have the house of Atreus, the house of Laius, the house of Oedipus, and there's 3 generations, and a mistake made by the grandfathers are visited by the grandsons. So he's agreeing with that, and in some sense, who knows if the stories have already been there and Hesiod's just summarizing, or if this is Hesiod has realized this and the paideia tradition was based upon it. So there's just a synchronistic cause-effect, all interconnected relationship here. It's not just linear. Best of all is the man who sees everything for himself, who looks ahead and sees what will be better in the end. So this is really, this is Prometheus, right? This is Prometheus' main rule to himself, is that you have foresight and you calculate the most efficient means to your ultimate goal, which is a flourishing life. And if you do that, you're going to come up with these conclusions. Wealth is better not grabbed, but given by the gods. If a man lays hold of wealth by main force, or if he pirates it with his tongue, as happens all too often when greed hoodwinks a man's sense, and decency gets crowded out by its opposite, the gods whittle him down just like that, shrink his household, and he doesn't stay rich for long. It's the same thing when somebody wrongs a suppliant, or a guest, or gets into his brother's bed and does with his sister-in-law what just isn't right. Okay, so the guest thing is what Paris did to Menelaus, and then the getting to your brother's bed with your sister-in-law is what Theseus did to Atreus. Okay, or like a damn fool wrongs an orphan, or raises his voice to his old pappy, using harsh language with him when he's at death's door. Zeus himself gets angry with a man like that, and in the end makes him pay for his wrongful acts. And then the last thing he says, don't let a sashaying female pull the wool over your eyes with her flirtatious lies. She's fishing for your barn. Trust a woman and you'd as well trust a thief. So it's hard for me to say anything else other than that Hesiod just plain old says women are greedy and they're rotten. but in the story of Pandora, in the story in Works and Days, it was the woman who opened the jar, so it was even the woman's fault. So again, it's ambiguous whose fault it is, right? Is it Prometheus' fault for stealing fire? Well, it seems like Hesiod thinks foresight is good, and stealing the fire and giving people better tools for being able to plan ahead might not necessarily be bad. But, and so maybe the problem is Epimetheus. Prometheus told him, don't take any gifts. And so maybe it's Epimetheus' fault for taking it. Well, but it was his wife that opened the jar, right? So maybe it's her fault. I think just like life, we're handed down. The situation we step into is the result of a whole lot of choices. And if you want to find one person to blame, you're going to be in trouble. So the key is, what lesson do you learn from all the choices that they made? Well, one lesson is You need to use Promethean foresight now after Pandora's box has been opened. You really need it. Maybe Prometheus was wrong then, but Promethean foresight is necessary now. But Epimethean temptation, being tempted by a woman like Epimetheus, is still bad. It's going to lead you to big trouble. Letting yourself, having a wife who's greedy and then trying to get rich quick or dishonestly is also bad. So you just have to put up with getting nagged, and you have to marry because, of course, you want some kids. You don't want to be left alone, so you're kind of stuck. Just don't listen to her. She'll nag you. Don't listen to her. And don't, be tempted by some sweet young thing. And then, of course, women. It doesn't seem to me Hesiod is trying to teach women anything, because he seems to think they're unteachable. And I think that's fair. I just don't know what else to say, except that Homer disagreed. Homer has some very, very noble, high-minded women in his story. Arete, and the Phoenician queen, and then Penelope also. So I think Homer is not as misogynist as Hesiod, and I think a lot of the other tragedians, although the main point of the Paideia tradition is it assumes a male-dominated world, for better or worse. This is what we have, and then it really focuses on male aggression, hubris, and all the ways things can go wrong. So with that in mind, with Hesiod's advice to his brothers saying justice is good, hubris is wrong, I read the Theogony as showing all the different kinds of hubris and what they lead to. And so when it comes to, he uses Pandora to explain diseases and those kind of problems, but he uses hubris to explain why we have these psychological patterns, how people develop these basically complexes. And so the gods and goddesses all represent a certain capacity of the human soul to be sacred. Something can be sacred, it can be part of a flourishing life, or when it's taken to an extreme, when it's hubris, then it becomes destructive. And I think Hesiod is using this cathartic tradition. He's magnifying all the mistakes people can make and showing what a disaster they will lead to and they have led to. This explains the world that we step into, where all these mistakes that were made in the past, way back. The other thing is that it's, if you read it really literally, it's not, you shouldn't read it as on the surface literal. Okay, so if you read it really literally, Hesiod is sitting there on the mountainside reflecting on the human condition. And then it dawns on him that there's patterns here, there's underlying causes that are the source of these patterns. That's when the Muses start speaking to him. And then they speak to the Zeus on Mount Olympus, who is this principle of equilibrium and evolution, a natural principle within which human beings have to exist. That's why he says, you'll get punished. Zeus will, those who kill will be killed. It'll come back to you. So the Zeus on Olympus is part of that. Then there's the human Zeus. So the Muses speak to the Zeus on Olympus. He has to learn about this stuff from the Muses. And the Muses became active because of the bard, because Hesiod, a man, made that transition from mere experience to this revelation, this understanding that we are this kind of creature in this kind of universe, and we understand justice. We can live according to justice. We can structure a set of laws and institutions that promote human flourishing and that promote stability. We imitate the natural world that way. We create an equilibrium, and that will give us the leisure to activate those higher powers, the Muses, to educate ourselves about lots of things. Um, so, but okay, so I think that he has had that revelation, and the Muses are talking to him, and then he set up that paradigm of the good person as exactly the same as in the Works and Days. The man who sits on the throne and makes judgments straight. So, um, so the Muses thrill the great mind deep in Olympus, and they also, okay, the Calliope, the muse of epic poetry, she keeps the company of revered kings when the daughters of great Zeus will honor a lord whose lineage is divine. The people all look to him as he arbitrates settlements with judgment straight. Okay, so Hesiod has understood that this is the paradigm for the person who contributes the most to human well-being, and the person that we should aspire to become, or we should make sure and live within those limits. We should live under the rule of law. We should appreciate that. We should avoid greed and avoid power struggles. So he's telling a story about this. Okay, so in the beginning, the first gods, what was there in the beginning? There was chaos, Gaia, earth, Tartarus, the underground, and Eros, okay, creativity or love. And he says Eros masters human beings' minds and subdues their wills. So he has this view that the principle of attraction and repulsion, the principle of energy, tends to be distracting. Okay, so I suppose that would be emotions or gets associated. Anyway, so he's kind of down on it. So I guess his view is it has to be controlled by reason. Okay, so in the first generation, you have these four forces, and Gaia starts unfolding, and then she brings out of herself heaven, Uranus. So now there's heaven and earth. Okay, and that's the first generation because that's the most basic. And it pretty much is, if earth is just a clump of a rock, then heaven and earth hardly ever change. But Gaia is also producing vegetation and the sea, and so the world is starting to develop, to have some change. So Gaia and Uranus together produce the Titans, the ocean, the water, the sun. Themis is a sea goddess who ultimately is the mother of Achilles, and Iapetos is from this generation, and he's the father of Prometheus and Epimetheus. But the key here is that they produce the monsters, and then they produce Cronus. Okay, so Cronus is time, and I think the story is about evolution. It's about natural evolution. So you start out with just Gaia, just a rock, and then the heavens, and then the rock, the earth, starts forming the earth and the vegetation, and it starts, the cycles, the natural cycles start having a history, like there would be an earthquake or there would be a flood, and that sort of is in time. It changes things. You don't have just a cycle anymore. What happens is, and I think this is a story, the story of Uranus and Cronus is Hesiod is magnifying human hubris, because literally he learned these stories from experience. He's showing you in the works and days that that's where he got it, and he's trying to explain the universe. And so what happens? Uranus has these monster kids, and he both is embarrassed by them because they're ugly, and he's afraid of them because they're powerful. And so he buries all of his children in the earth. He's threatened by his children, right? So men do that. If you have your ego caught up in your children, and I tell my students this, if you just want your kid to be a chip off the old block and do whatever, I don't know, if your ego is totally caught up with your kid, then what happens if the child isn't quite as smart as you, or as handsome as you, or comes out crippled? Okay, you're embarrassed by them. Is that good for the child? No, it's awful. It's emotionally crippling. What happens if the kid is more powerful than you and has more opportunities and is a little more gifted and talented? Well, then you compete with them. And so this is a violation. This is hubris. This is overstepping the bounds in the relationship between fathers and sons. And also, it's a story of evolution. Every generation, the children are going to be moving forward in history. It might not necessarily be morally forward. You could be pretty wicked, but it's going to be a more complex society every generation, which is the creation story has natural evolution and social evolution. So the move from Uranus and Gaia was outside of time in the cycles of light of nature, and then Cronus was born, and so now you're moving forward to thinking of the life on Earth as existing in time. And you have this problem with Uranus, is that he's threatened by his children. He doesn't want change because he won't be as powerful. He wants to maintain his power. So this is a kind of hubris. And so what happens to the women? Well, the women in a male-dominated situation, they can't speak directly to the guy. So they have to be passive-aggressive. So Gaia gets out a sickle and says to all of her children, okay, who's going to cut off his genitals? I'm tired of him having kids and burying them in the earth. Crippling them, right? So Cronus volunteers, which of course Cronus represents the next layer, the next stage of evolution. So he cuts off his father's energy. His genitals represent his energy, his ability to reproduce, his ability to have power. And then he replaces his father as king of the gods. Now, the trouble is, Cronus himself gets very paranoid because he thinks one of his kids is going to overpower him, which of course his child will. Every generation. Parents' children overpower them in the sense that they eventually take over. So you can be threatened by it, or you can just have a peaceful transfer of power. This is where those two kinds of strife come in Hesiod. There was the Eris, the awful kind of strife that's violent, or the competitive, positive kind of strife, the desire to do better, which is a positive thing and leads to evolution. So it could have been a positive father-son relationship, and the son is just determined to do a little bit better, and things evolve. But the story is not. The story is very much about the hubris, excess, and that creates all sorts of troubles. Okay, so then Cronus takes over, and the generation of he and his consort, the second generation, includes Hestia, the reflective. She's the contemplative goddess of the hearth. Demeter, the goddess of fertility. So that makes sense that now you're starting to get vegetation. And her daughter, Persephone. And Hera is concerned with honoring. And then her son, Hephaestus. So the first generation of women, or the second generation, the children of Cronus and Rhea, Hestia, the goddess of the hearth, Demeter, the goddess of fertility, her daughter, Persephone, and Hera, the wife of Zeus, and the goddess of honor. The males of that generation are Hades, the god of the underworld, Poseidon, the god of the sea, Zeus, the god of the sky, and justice. But then the fates decreed that one of his children would overpower him. So he literally devoured his children. He ate his children. And again, we even use that expression when somebody psychologically, especially a father in a patriarchy, just overpowers his children, doesn't let them do anything. We'll say he's devouring his kids. He's just crippling them psychologically. He's not letting them have any idea of what contribution they might make to the society, how to develop their talents, what their talents are. They're just supposed to obey their father. So what happened, of course, is that his consort, Rhea, was not real happy about this. And so she goes to the grandparents, to Uranus, who says, will you help me? And of course the grandparents say, sure, after what he did to me, yeah, I'll help you. So they get Zeus off to Crete, and then Rhea gives Cronus a stone to eat instead of Zeus, and Zeus is raised over in Crete. So once again, the women are passive aggressive. They can't face the guy and say this is unjust. They just have to do it passively, and that is what happens to women in a patriarchy. They have to find another man to do their dirty work for them, or to bring things back to justice. Actually, when they get treated unjustly, they have to find a man to fix it. Okay, so what happens is that eventually Cronus is tricked into throwing up his kids, so they come back to life, and then Zeus takes over as king of the gods. And Zeus is the god of justice. So you make that transition from things existing in time to justice, which is interrelationships between gods, and which are a reflection of interrelationships between people. So now we have the generation, the emergence of culture. And so this goes right back to systems thinking, to current physics, about how the universe has emerged. One system emerges from another. Human culture emerges from nature. Okay. Alright, so then we have Zeus and the next generation. And what happened was, Zeus also was afraid that his children would overpower him. So his first wife is Metis. And Metis is good judgment. So Prometheus means pro-judgment, foresight. Epimetheus means hindsight, right? So the word, it gets translated sight, which is kind of interesting because intuition also is the notion of being able to see. So Metis represents that capacity to see. And so that was a great choice for Zeus. He should have stuck with her. Because, when you have Zeus, the god of justice, enforcing the equilibrium, and you have Metis, who's able to see, she can give him good advice. But no, he was threatened, especially since she was wiser than him. He was threatened that he would have a child that's wiser and more just than him. So he plays a game with her. They take turns being animals, and she becomes a fly and he swallows her. But she was pregnant, and so he gets this terrible headache, and he tells Hephaestus, the god of the forge, to chip open his forehead, and out comes Athena. And Athena does have better judgment than him, all the way through Homer. And so, Zeus, you should have stuck with Metis. You could have had a lot of very just and wise children, but you didn't. You had one, thank God, sort of against your will, in spite of it all. And she gives you advice in Homer, in the Iliad, and sometimes you take it and sometimes you don't. But anyway, so again, it was Zeus's obsession about not wanting to be overpowered that got a lot of bad things in motion. So this goes back to Jung's idea of a complex, and this is really important. So these stories are about the father complex in a patriarchy. All of a society is affected by these father-son relationships when the fathers and the sons are the ones that have all the power. And of course that comes up in Homer big time. So we'll see that very soon. But it's also an authority complex, and it's a power complex. So the father complex, the authority complex, and the power complex all get rolled into one in this case. In the case of Agamemnon and Achilles, Agamemnon is not Achilles' father, but he's his authority figure, and they get into a big power struggle. But, so what happens? Remember when Jung talked about what happens to people when they are obsessed, when they're in this out of balance. So we go back to Aristotle's idea of the mean between extremes. And when you get out of balance, what happens? Then you go to Jung and his discussion of complexes. And people have an inflated sense of their righteousness, right? I'm right, you're wrong. They project, it's always the other guy's fault. It's your fault, it's your fault, no, it's not my fault. And they have a very inflated sense of how righteous they are and of how powerful they are. And this is classic, as they say. It's exactly how these people act, or these gods act. And again, Hesiod is the bard, and he presented himself that way, that he got these stories from experience and reflecting upon experience and making that transition from experience to art. That was when the Muses became active in his mind, and this is the story that they inspired him to tell. And that goes back to Jung's view of the artist. The great artist is outside of himself, feels beyond himself, has put himself into this level of living out an archetype. And one example of that is Sojourner Truth, right? This woman, at one point in her life, she decided she was on this archetypal journey, and she renamed herself Searcher for Truth. So that's the idea, is that the artist is a searcher for truth, but he tells his truth through poetry, epic poetry, and well, all the muses, and then and then other people recite it. So, but what happened? So after Zeus devoured Metis out of hubris, this excessive heuristic strife, excess strife, desire to control, then he started having sex with a lot of other women, and they had offspring, and as a result, the offspring are all capable of living apart, behaving in ways that violate justice. So they aren't tied to justice. They're the children of justice, of Zeus, but not Zeus and Metis. They're Zeus um, violating his marriage covenant. I mean, he's married to Hera, and he's unfaithful, and so his sexual attraction got connected to disconnected from civilization and marriage. So that that's what Hesiod sees, and that's what happened when Cronus cut off his father Uranus' genitals. He threw them in the sea, and the foam, out of the foam came Aphrodite, and then Eros became her consort. So what was originally one of the four forces of the universe, Eros, becomes basically the slave of Aphrodite, and Aphrodite is um, pleasure, and specifically sexual pleasure, but any kind of pleasure, cut off from civilization, and that's what happens. And Zeus allows himself to be driven by sexual passion cut off from justice, from his own community, and it leads to offspring whose powers come from the they're part of the powers of a creature that by nature would desire to understand, but because of their origin, because the woman in each case was not the wife and she was not wise, they can use these powers for pleasure or all sorts of irrational goals, or they can use it to support justice. And in the next lecture, then, I'll talk about Zeus's women and then their children, and how that was Hesiod's way of explaining all the patterns, the psychological patterns. So Pandora is one kind of evil, but the other issue is, how is it that our reasoning capacities, and the obvious one from the works and days is that so much of the works and days is using Apollonian reasoning, the power to calculate. He talks about how to make a calendar, how to check the winds, how to all these ways to use your reasoning to promote your own flourishing, and also always to stay within the limits of justice. So you don't use your reasoning to try and get rich, or the gods will come back. And you don't use your reasoning to bribe, to violate the laws, or to behave in ways that ought to be illegal. And you always use your reasoning in under the service of justice. So then he's trying to explain, based on the origins of the universe, some deeply seated patterns, how it is that that capacity got split off. And then he creates these characters, these gods, who represent what happens when our reasoning capacities, or each of the deities represents some capacity we have based on the human condition. But what happens when they go to an extreme, right? When they become a complex. And it's fascinating. And then the last point I'm going to make in the next lecture is that Hesiod does reaffirm all of Aristotle's virtues. He would agree with Aristotle about all the virtues. He would agree with the extremes, that each of those virtues can go to an extreme. They become obsessive. They become complexes, like Jung described. And in the end, the healthy person has integrity. They integrate all of those powers in a way that promotes human flourishing. So human flourishing has to take place within a context of a community based on justice, and then that creates the cultural conditions for the flourishing of the Muses, of the arts and sciences. And the flourishing of the arts and sciences are the tools that we have to educate ourselves as the creature that naturally desires to know in a universe that's naturally knowable. So if we have that stability we get from a just community, we can start engaging in astronomy, astrology, biology, right? Understanding the natural world, um, which he does when he's just calculating his well-being, but we can do that better. We can create dance, poetry, epic poetry, love poetry, um, and we can do it to inspire ourselves in positive emotions like hymns to the gods. But we also can create epic poetry where we magnify. Look, you're not going to be able to maintain a good, flourishing society unless you're constantly reminding yourself of all the temptations, unless you have those stories about people that gave in to complexes and all the problems that caused, so that you constantly are flushing that out and maintaining your desire to understand and getting pleasure out of the fact that you know what people can do wrong, and you know you can trust yourself that you won't go there, but only because you keep reminding yourself, recollecting, remembering, and listening to the stories of the poets who are the great educators.